unemployment, and a second half of the presentation focusing specifically on cyclical unemployment. Unemployment occurs when people who are willing and able to work are unable to find a job or are simply not working. The unemployment rate is calculated by looking at the number of people who are out of work and dividing that by the total available workforce times 100 to give you a percent. So if you want to give a quick example, you could say there's a country of 100 people and 5 people are out of work. So 5 divided by 100 gives you 0.05 times 100 gives you 5% of that population is unemployed. It's very difficult to measure in real life though, because most countries have more than 100 people, but also because of differences between age, gender, race, geographic regions. So a lot of times populations that are between the ages of 18 and 25, as well as populations that are 55 and older, deal with a lot more unemployment than the rest of the total workforce. Women sometimes face greater unemployment than men, although not universally throughout the world. Different racial groups might face higher levels of unemployment, and different regions of a country might see higher levels of unemployment. There's hidden employment, which we typically refer to as off-the-books work, when people are doing work and they're not reporting it to the government to avoid taxes, but they are working, so they may be counted as unemployed when they're not. Discouraged workers are not counted as out of work, but they're also not considered part of the available workforce. Discouraged workers are those people who've depleted their benefits and they no longer report as unemployed to the government because there's no benefit to be gotten, and so they are no longer counted, and that's something that often skews unemployment numbers. Underemployed is when someone is working a part-time job and they really are able to work a more productive full-time job, so they're counted as employed, but their employment situation is not ideal based on their skill set. And then finally, in LDCs, least developed countries, it can be very challenging to get this information. It's even challenging in a developed country, but LDCs are going to face a lot of problems, starting with successfully establishing a census to get the idea of what the available workforce looks like, and also including the fact that if they don't offer unemployment benefits, why would people go out of their way to report themselves as unemployed? So difficult even more for LDCs to figure out their unemployment number. Why is unemployment important? Best to break it down as cost to the unemployed, cost to society, cost to economy as a whole. There's a lot of different things that fit under the cost to the unemployed category, but the short of it is they are impoverished over time because they have a lack of income, so they have a decline in their standard of living. So obviously, if you're the unemployed person, it's very easy to see how you're hurt by unemployment. People often forget about society and the economy as a whole. If there's unemployed people, not only might they be disruptive to society in extreme circumstances, an unemployed person might turn the crime, but much more practically, unemployed people get unemployment benefits, and there's a lot of reasons why that's a good thing. The short of it is, if unemployed people get small check from the government, they're going to go ahead and spend that, and money will circulate in the economy. But society also has to pay for that through tax money. So society has to pay for unemployment in that regard. And the economy as a whole, there's only really one way to approach this. When there is unemployment in the economy, we're not having a level of output at the full level of output. We're not at YF, so the economy as a whole is not operating at its most efficient level. So that's really the only way to explain that, but that's important. So the unemployed are hurt, but so is society and the overall economy. Important to be able to explain all three when talking about unemployment, because you need to drive home the fact that it affects more than just the unemployed person. Whenever you draw an unemployment diagram, always start with this labor market diagram. ADL is the total demand for labor in a nation, assuming you're using a nation when you're talking about unemployment. ASL is the aggregate supply of labor, so it's the total amount of people who are making themselves available to work. Wages, we see WE, an equilibrium wage. That just is the average wage in the economy where this labor market exists. And QE is the number of workers who are employed based on this equilibrium. That's important, that equilibrium, as we talk about the two types of unemployment. So we're going to get to a situation where we want to show the problem and then we want to correct the problem, which is quite common for us when we're discussing economic issues. So let's talk about cyclical unemployment now. Cyclical unemployment is caused by a downturn in the economy, a decrease in AD, thus the other name for cyclical unemployment, demand deficient, when there is a lack of AD because consumption and or investment and or government spending and or the foreign sector is not performing. This type of unemployment is a really great concern because it goes hand in hand with a decline in output, and if it goes unchecked, it can raise to double-digit numbers and a lot of people will be suffering. It goes back to our cost to the unemployed and society as a whole. So whenever we diagram cyclical unemployment, we start with this economy as a whole diagram. And I use the Keynesian model for this, and what I'm trying to show here is that as AD decreases because of the recession, we go from YF to Y1 and we decrease here in our level of output. So a recession occurs, AD goes to AD1, and our output declines. And as output declines, firms are going to no longer need as many workers as they needed before this recession. So I go back to my labor market equilibrium. I always start with this diagram, and then I add a third curve. I shift ADL to ADL1, a new demand for labor. This shows the decrease in the aggregate demand for labor that occurs after the recession. Now notice that I'm not going to draw a new equilibrium wage. I'm going to stick with the initial equilibrium wage, and I'm going to look at where Q1 is. Here's Q1, and the gap between QE and Q1 is cyclical unemployment. This is what unemployment was before the recession, or I should say, this is what employment was before the recession, and this is what employment is after the recession. People will still be making the same average wage. That's why we keep this line and we say, okay, WE hits ADL1 here, and this is what employment is after the recession. Now, over time, wages might go down to WE1, and QE1 might become the new number of people who are employed if the recession persists and we stay at ADL1 and AD never improves over a prolonged period. But why do we typically say that wages will stay at WE? We say wages are sticky downward. It's a lot of things have to happen for wages to go down. People won't accept their employer going to them and saying, oh, we're cutting your wages because we're in a national recession right now. They will go and look for another job. But if you're talking about a period of prolonged recession over 2-3 longer years, then maybe wages will start to slip as some of the higher paid workers get, they retire, and then I hire workers at a lower wage, or maybe over time union workers negotiate contracts and they agree to a wage cut so that they don't lose jobs. So wages will go down eventually, but not right away. I generally would say you don't need to diagram WE1, you just need to say wages are sticky, and this diagram here will be enough to explain cyclical unemployment. How do we address cyclical unemployment? Well, let's start with a Keynesian or demand side approach. Since Keynesians always look at the demand side, they're going to say, let's find ways to increase aggregate demand, which will in turn lead to an increase in output, which will in turn lead to an increase in aggregate demand for labor. And there's two ways to do this: expansionary fiscal policy or expansionary monetary policy. These two approaches are covered at length in the Keynesian presentation, so go back and look at expansionary fiscal and expansionary monetary policy and take note of the pros and cons of each policy, because if you're answering a question about the effectiveness of demand-side policy for addressing cyclical unemployment, the answer is yes, it is effective, but both strategies come with pros and cons, and you need to be able to discuss those pros and cons. Let me explain how you diagram that. Here is our initial economy as a whole showing the recession. Well, by using expansionary demand-side policy, I go, instead of going from AD to AD1, by using expansionary policy, I move from AD1 back to AD. So I don't need to draw a new diagram if I'm answering on an exam. I simply would say that by using expansionary demand side policy, I reverse this initial shift and I move back towards AD by using expansionary policy. And I also don't have to draw a new labor market diagram. I simply say that by using expansionary policy, I will increase AD, I will increase output, and that will return us to the original aggregate demand for labor. So by using demand side policy, I improve the economy, and then that will make firms go back to demanding labor the way they once had, and this shift to the left will essentially be erased and we'll go back to our initial equilibrium, and employment will go back to QE. The classical or free market approach to addressing cyclical unemployment is simply to wait it out. They would say that, after all, it's called cyclical unemployment. It's due to the cyclical downturn of the economy. And as with any cycle, what will once go down will eventually go back up. So they would say wait for the economy to naturally recover, and AD will eventually go up beyond where it ever was before, and unemployment will go away. The other view of this is if the recession is prolonged, eventually those sticky wages will budge downwards, and that will mitigate the unemployment problem. But ultimately, the free market approach boils down to if you wait it out, the economy will recover, and the cyclical unemployment is just a phase that we have to deal with. The evaluation, I would use the example of the Great Depression and how Depression-era presidents, Herbert Hoover being the most infamous of them, took a laissez-faire free market approach, saying wait it out, the economy will recover, that's how the economy works. And it's pretty hard to tell citizens that year after year when unemployment during that time was about a quarter of the population, 25%. So this free market approach, again, if you use the classical model and you look at the business cycle, it's easy to stand with this approach, but it really ignores the fact that and the Keynesians would say this doesn't work. If you wait it out, you might just be dealing with a perpetual recession. You need government intervention. So that is a summary of unemployment and a summary of one type of unemployment, cyclical unemployment. Follow-up presentation will focus on natural unemployment.